Just before sunrise, Elias heard it, a hollow groan rolling beneath the cabin floorboards. Not wind, not water, something failing, something being swallowed. The swamp had begun taking back the land they stole. At first light, the swamp looked peaceful, hushed beneath a silver-blue haze that clung low to the earth. But Elias Warren already knew something was wrong. He could feel it before he saw it. The ground trembled in a slow, syrupy way beneath his boots. The soil, waterlogged after a night of heavy mist that never quite became rain. Every step sent up the smell of rot, sweet, bitter, unmistakable. He tightened the strap of his pack and moved closer to the cabin he and the other settlers had raised only 8 months earlier. The cabin should have towered solidly above him, but instead, it sagged like a living thing giving up under its own weight. The bottom logs had darkened into a sickly black green, and the earth directly beneath the foundation was no longer earth at all, but a shallow, soupy basin. A soft thunk echoed from inside, followed by a low groan. Elias paused. Wet wood didn't just sag, it moved. He wasn't alone. Mist curled around a figure perched in the shade of a red maple. Atsudi, the Cherokee craftsman who had watched the settlers build this cabin last autumn. He had said little back then, only that the swamp did not like to share the earth with heavy things. Settlers, eager to prove themselves, had laughed it off. Now, Atsadi simply watched in silence, his dark eyes tracking every shifting angle of the structure. Elias cleared his throat. It started sinking last week, but nothing like this. Atsadi did not move. His voice, when it came, was low and even. It is not sinking, it is rotting. The ground breathes here. Too much water rises. Too little air moves. Wood cannot live in such a place unless it stands above it. Elias felt a sting of embarrassment. He and the settlers had cut every log straight, stacked them tight, sealed the seams with mud and moss, everything they'd been taught to do in drier lands. But the swamp was not the dry frontier. Here the air itself felt alive, thick, pressing into the skin, condensing against wood like a warning. He crouched and pressed his fingertips against the lowest log. The bark-soft surface dented in like wet leather. Good God, Elias whispered. It's melting. A faint creak echoed overhead. Both men instinctively stepped back. The corner beam bulged outward, pushed by internal pressure. Mold growing in threads under the surface, swelling, rupturing fibers like overripe fruit. Atsadi spoke again, hands folded calmly behind his back. When wood cannot breathe, it dies. When the ground gives water and takes none back, it drinks your home. Elias didn't want to admit it, but the Cherokee builder was right. This wasn't just a structural failure. It was a warning from the land itself. He circled the cabin, taking in the small details he had ignored for months. Mushrooms blooming like white fans along the sill, thin, spidery threads of fungus crawling up between the log joints, a line of ants marching toward the wet underside, where rot softened the earth. The whole structure smelled of warm decay, moisture trapped in darkness, slowly turning wood to sponge. Then came a deep, splitting crack. The front corner collapsed inward, the floorboards giving way into a dark pool of mud beneath. Water gurgled up through the new opening, filling the void where a family would have slept. Elias's stomach twisted. 8 months, he said quietly. We gave this everything. Atsadi tilted his head, listening to the wood groan like a wounded animal. It is not your fault, he said. Your building remembers another land. It does not know this one. Those words settled heavily on Elias. He had crossed mountains, rivers, forest, and prairie, carrying methods taught by his father and his father before him. But no one had warned him that knowledge itself had a climate, that homes needed to be shaped by the land they lived on. A cool breath of wind swept under the collapsed floor. It carried something unexpected, the faint aroma of cedar smoke and clean, cured wood. Elias turned. Through the thinning mist, not far beyond the dead cabin, stood another structure, raised high on stone footings and supported by thick cedar posts. Its plank floor hovered nearly 3 feet above the swamp. Light cut through narrow ventilation gaps. The wood, clean, pale, preserved, glimmered faintly with morning dew. It was Atsadi's family cabin. Unlike the settler's cabin, it showed no rot, no sag, no fungus. Underneath it, the earth was surprisingly dry, almost firm. Elias moved toward it slowly, drawn to the contrast. But this place is built in the same swamp, same rain, same heat. Why doesn't yours rot? Atsadi walked beside him. Because it is not touched by the ground. The air moves beneath, the wood stays dry, the swamp cannot reach it. Elias knelt to inspect the underside. Breezes slipped through the shaded space, creating a cool, almost pleasant flow. Even the insects seemed fewer here, frustrated, repelled by the dryness under the elevated floor. And the wood, cedar, hickory, pine, smelled alive, treated with light smoke, lightly cured, protected by airflow. Elias exhaled. We built wrong from the first log. Atsadi nodded once. The swamp teaches quickly, but only if you listen. Another violent crack echoed behind them. The settler's cabin slumped further, its front door disappearing into sludge. A slow wave of mud pushed outward like the swamp exhaling. Elias closed his eyes. People could have been inside. Atsadi placed a steady hand on his shoulder. It is good you saw this. You are still alive to learn. The morning mist lifted just enough to reveal the whole sinking frame, tilted, twisted, half swallowed by the land. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Everything he thought he knew about building, about survival, about the rules of nature, none of it meant anything here. Only one structure had resisted the swamp. Only one method had proven itself, and it came from knowledge he had never been taught. But what troubled Elias most was not how the cabin died, but how the Cherokee cabin lived. And he would soon learn the swamp had far worse tests waiting. Elias Warren followed Atsadi toward the elevated Cherokee cabin, still shaken by the collapse behind them. The swamp around them steamed in the growing heat, the air thick enough to feel on the skin. But beneath Atsadi's cabin, the temperature dropped almost 10 degrees. Cool air sifted upward through the slatted floor, brushing Elias's face like the breath of a different world. He crouched low, eyes adjusting to the shadowed space under the cabin. The ground beneath was surprisingly firm, crumbly soil, instead of the swamp's slick, sucking mud. It didn't make sense. The land was the same. The rain was the same. The humidity was merciless everywhere. So why did the earth under this structure feel dry? Atsadi knelt beside him, tapping the supporting post with a knuckle. The wood rang sharp and clean. The cabin breathes, he said. Yours drowned. Elias ran a hand along the lower beam. It was warm but dry, lightly smoked, faintly aromatic with cedar resin. There was no swelling, no softening, not even the thin white film of early mold he had grown used to seeing on the settler's supplies. He swallowed. How high did you know to build it? I did not choose the height, Atsadi replied. The land did. Before Elias could ask, Atsadi pointed toward the shallow ridges in the soil, the marks where floodwaters had crept during spring rains. The water rises this far, but the air moves here. He tapped the empty space beneath the cabin, and that is enough for the wood to stay alive. Elias stared at the shaded void. He had never thought much about airflow. Back home, the land was dry enough that rot came slowly, like an old sickness. Here, rot was a predator. It hunted warmth, darkness, stillness. Atsadi stepped aside, gesturing for Elias to follow him around the back of the cabin. Come, see what the swamp tried to do, and what it could not. They stopped beside one of the rear support stones, flat granite, carefully chosen, carefully placed. The cedar post rested on top of it without touching the soil, not buried, not packed in mud, simply balanced with deliberate precision. Elias blinked. You don't sink the posts into the ground? No, Atsadi smiled faintly. Why would I feed the swamp what it wants to eat? Elias rubbed his chin. The settlers had done exactly that. Dug their foundation deep, letting moisture seep upward like a wick. They had created their own failure before the walls ever stood. Atsadi turned toward the cabin wall and pressed his palm against the bark-clad siding. This is river birch. It sheds water, Under it is pine, cured with smoke for 3 nights. The smoke lifts out the wet and leaves only what endure. He peeled back a small flap of bark, revealing the pale, immaculate wood beneath. Elias leaned in, expecting at least some softness or spotting. There was none. It looks new, he whispered. It should, Atsadi replied. A house should not age faster than its people. They circled back to the front porch. Elias sat heavily on the top step, overwhelmed. Why didn't any of us know this, he asked. We built cabins all across the valley. Same design, same method. And they're all rotting. Atsadi sat beside him. Your people build for the wind, for snow, for cold. You build to fight the sky, but this place does not attack from above. He looked toward the swamp, where the surface quivered with hidden movement. It attacks from below. That truth sank into Elias like a stone in water. The settlers had fought the wrong enemy. They had never understood what would kill their homes. Behind them, thunder rumbled faintly. Storm season was coming early. Elias exhaled slowly. Will the others listen? After today, Atsadi's expression softened. Some will not. But the swamp does not care about pride. It only cares about what stands in its way. A silence settled between them. The thick, humid air carried distant bird calls, the soft clicking of insects, and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Elias felt suddenly small, like a man standing inside someone else's knowledge. Then Atsadi rose and pointed toward the sinking settler cabin. Come, there is more you must see. They stood at the edge of the ruin as another section of wall gave way. Mold spumed out from a newly shattered seam. The floor tilted more sharply toward the mud pool forming beneath it. The air reeked of wet decay. Atsadi spoke quietly. A house that touches the swamp becomes the swamp. Elias clenched his jaw. I don't want to build anything that dies the same year I raise it. Then build what breathes, Atsadi said softly. I will teach you. Thunder rolled again. The sky darkened slightly. A humid wind licked across the clearing. A wet, heavy warning of what the next weeks would bring. Elias had a choice: cling to the old ways or learn a new one. And for the first time since he arrived in this unforgiving land, he knew the path he had to take. Before we push deeper into this story, I'd love to know something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? If tales of forgotten frontier engineering and real survival wisdom spark something in you, consider subscribing. We explore a new piece of lost knowledge every day, and tomorrow's episode might carry a lesson that outlasts the storms we face now. But even Atsadi's elevated cabin would soon face a test the swamp was famous for, a test that destroyed whole settlements. By midday, the clouds had thinned into long gray veils, letting filtered sunlight spill across the clearing. Elias followed Atsadi to a work area behind the elevated cabin, a small clearing marked by stumps, stacked split logs, coils of vine rope, and strips of bark hanging from branches to dry. It looked less like a workshop and more like a quiet outdoor classroom, where the swamp itself was the textbook. Atsadi picked up a cedar slab and handed it to Elias. Lift it. Elias expected heavy weight, but the wood rose lightly in his hands, firm yet airy. It smelled of resin and smoke. The texture surprised him, smooth in the grain, but feathered slightly at the surface where the smoke curing had drawn out moisture. It's dry, Elias said, wiping his palms. Drier than anything we milled. It has been drying for weeks, Atsadi replied. But only after it was chosen. Chosen how? Atsadi gestured toward a stand of trees near the edge of the swamp. Cedar grows with the land, not against it. It does not drink as deeply, and it holds oils that fight rot and insects. Hickory is strong but must be cured. River birch sheds water. Each wood has a spirit. Each must be used where it wants to live. Elias let his fingers trace the surface again. The settlers had taken whatever logs were closest. Downed pine, damp oak, half-dried birch. Convenience had been their guide. Efficiency had been their curse. Atsadi placed several logs in a row on the earth. Some were set directly on the ground. Others rested on short stones. Watch, he said. The swamp will do the teaching. Hours passed slowly. The wet heat rose. The air became heavy again, swelling like a wet cloth. Elias checked the logs every so often, wiping his forehead, feeling sweat drip down his neck. First, the grounded logs changed color, faintly at first, then rapidly. A white fuzz appeared at the base. Ants gathered in scouting lines. The logs raised on stones stayed clean. Elias knelt, studying the difference. It hasn't even been a full day. In this land, Atsadi said, a single hour is enough for rot to begin its work. Moisture rises through anything that touches the ground, like blood through cloth. Elias swallowed. So our cabin's wicked moisture upward from the posts. Yes, you built a path for water to climb. Atsadi lifted a hand, guiding Elias's attention to the breeze slipping beneath the raised cabin. Airflow interrupts the climb. The swamp moves upward. The wind moves sideways. They fight each other. The wood stays between them and remains itself. Elias exhaled. So air is the difference between wood living and dying. Atsadi nodded. Air and patience. He gestured toward a smoking pit dug shallow into the earth. Strips of cedar and hickory hung above it, absorbing thin trails of smoke. The flame was not visible, only smoldering coals, producing a steady, controlled billow. This, Atsadi said, is curing. The smoke dries the wood slowly, safely. It pushes out the water before the swamp can pull it back in. Elias studied the motion of the smoke, how it wrapped the wood, seeped into it, left a matte texture behind. We only season wood in the open. Let the sun do it. The sun dries too quickly, Atsadi replied. It makes the wood thirst. Then the swamp gives it water, and it drinks too fast. That is how rot grows from inside. Elias stared at the smoking pit with new respect. You dry it gently, without shocking it, like teaching a child to breathe, Atsadi said. The afternoon heat deepened. Cicadas hummed louder. Sweat trickled from Elias's brow, but he barely noticed. He leaned closer to the pit, absorbing every detail, the angle of the sticks, the spacing of the slats, the rake used to turn the coals, so the temperature stayed even. How long do you cure it? He asked. 3 nights for thin planks, Atsadi said. 7 nights for beams. Longer if the swamp is angry. Elias's eyebrows rose. You read the swamp's mood? Atsadi smiled subtly. Every land has moods. Yours does too. But the swamp speaks louder. They walked back toward the raised cabin, shadows lengthening across the clearing. Atsadi knelt beneath it once more and traced a small gap between 2 floorboards. Here, he said. Air enters from below and leaves from above. The boards are close enough to walk on, far enough to let the wind pass. This stops the moisture from settling. Elias crouched beside him. We sealed our floors tight, Atsadi said, and you trapped the swamp inside. Elias sat back in the shaded earth, overwhelmed by how simple the truth was and how blind he had been to it. Everything the settlers had built was airtight, heavy, closed, strong against cold winds, perhaps, but utterly helpless against humidity. His gaze drifted toward the tree line. Could we rebuild using these methods? Raise the floors, cure the wood, leave gaps for air? You could, Atsadi said. But you must believe the swamp is not your enemy. It is your teacher. A breeze swept through the clearing. Under Atsadi's cabin, the wind moved freely. Cool, refreshing, relieving. The structure seemed almost alive, shifting subtly with the air, not resisting but cooperating with the land. Behind them, the rotten settler cabin creaked again. A new cloud of spores puffed from its collapsed wall. It looked more like a carcass now, sinking deeper into the mud. Elias rubbed his palms against his trousers. A cabin that breathes versus a cabin that suffocates. The choice is easy, Atsadi said. The work is hard. Elias nodded. Then I'll start today. Atsadi's voice softened. Good. Because the swamp is not done with you yet. For when the insects came, even the breathing cabin would face a new kind of siege. And Elias had no idea how relentless the swarm season truly was. By late afternoon, the swamp felt heavier than ever. The air hung thick, pressing down on Elias's shoulders like a warm, wet cloth. Heat shimmering over the waterlogged ground distorted the tree line. The buzzing of insects grew into a layered hum, high whines, low thrums, the steady ticking of wings brushing bark. It felt as though the swamp itself was vibrating. Atsadi led Elias toward a patch of ground where the settlers had once boasted of clearing space for several new cabins. But now that clearing was alive with movement, beetles crawling up soggy stumps, ants threading in frantic lines, mosquitoes thick enough to shape shadows. Elias swatted at his neck. They're everywhere. More than I've ever seen. Atsadi nodded calmly. The swamp wakes this time of year. The insects rise first. Then the snakes come to hunt them. He pointed toward the ground, where a thin track wove through the mud. Cottonmouth. Fresh trail. Elias's blood chilled. They get into cabins, too. Only the ones touching the earth, Atsadi replied. A raised house gives them no reason. They walked toward another collapsed settler structure, smaller, built in haste, and Elias stopped short. The entire floor was crawling with termites. A large cottonmouth coiled lazily in the shadowed corner, half hidden behind a warped floorboard. A murky, wet smell filled the space, rot mixed with snake musk. Elias shivered. This was a home, he murmured. A family lived here. Atsadi crouched beside the warped wall. Look at how the insects move. They follow damp wood first. They avoid dry wood. He placed his hand against one of the darkened boards. This one drinks water. When it does, the insects smell it. He stood and motioned for Elias to follow him back to the elevated cabin. As they approached, the buzzing swarms thinned. Insects peeled away, almost reluctantly, veering off as though repelled by something invisible. Elias slowed. Why aren't they landing on yours? Because there is no reward for them here, Atsadi said. No wet wood, no dark ground, no trapped heat. The raised cabin breathed coolness into the space beneath it. The shade was sharp and clean, the soil dry and crumbly instead of damp. A snake would have no warmth to seek. An insect would find no moisture to feed on. Atsadi knelt and lifted a handful of earth from under the cabin. It trickled through his fingers like powder. A house that stays dry below becomes a place of peace, not a place of hunting, not a place of feeding. Elias walked around the structure, noticing things he hadn't before. Thin curls of smoked bark hung under the eaves. The scent was subtle but constant. River birch siding overlapped like scales, loose enough to shift with the wind, tight enough to shed water. Every opening carried a slow exhale of cool air. And there were no insects, not even a trail. Smoke keeps them away? Elias asked. Yes, Atsadi said. Smoke cures the wood and confuses the insects. They do not like what they cannot read. The oils in cedar and birch turn them aside. Elias breathed deeply. The cabin smelled earthy, like seasoned timber and faint traces of campfire, not the sour, wet smell of decay that clung to the settlers' cabins. Atsadi stepped back toward the fallen settler home. Look there, he said. Elias followed his gaze and froze. A cottonmouth slithered out from beneath the cracked floorboards. Its scales glistened in the fading light. It paused, tongue flicking toward them, then slid into the mud and vanished between the reeds. A chill crept down Elias's spine. They live under our homes because of the warmth and the rot, Atsadi added. Rot grows heat. Heat draws snakes. Snakes draw more insects. Everything feeds the next thing. Elias watched the water ripple where the snake had entered. And your cabin? The air under it is too cool, too dry. Snakes do not want their bellies cold. Atsadi gave a small smile. They prefer your house. It wasn't a joke. It was a lesson. He motioned toward the open space beneath the raised cabin. Airflow is not only for wood, it is for safety. Raised homes have no corners on the ground, no dark pockets, no easy place for a coil. Elias knelt again, this time studying the entire underside with sharp attention. Every part of it felt deliberate. The height, the spacing, the stones under the posts, the steady airflow. A cabin like this, he murmured, doesn't just fight rot. It refuses predators. Atsadi nodded. Yes, and we do not use poison. We do not trap. We use the land's own rules. The humming of insects dimmed as the sun drifted lower, casting long shadows over the swamp. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, and the underfloor gap breathed coolness into Elias's face. But the peace was temporary. Atsadi looked up toward the canopy, where clouds thickened in slow, rolling masses. The light turned yellow, then orange, then a darker, bruised hue. Humidity deepened again, as though the land was inhaling before a storm. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "the swamp will grow hotter, the insects will rise higher, and the rains may come early." Elias straightened. "Will this cabin stand?" "It will live," Atsadi said. "But standing is not the same as surviving. Storm season tests the spaces between the wood." A gust of wind shifted the bark siding with soft rattles. The swamp rustled in answer, uneasy, restless. Elias studied the raised cabin, its quiet strength, its intelligent design, and for the first time, he truly feared for it. If the swamp had nearly eaten the settlers' homes whole, what would it do when it came for this one? The first storm of the season was only hours away, and the swamp was preparing its assault. Elias would soon witness whether a breathing cabin could endure the swamp's full fury. By dawn, the swamp was no longer merely wet. It was alive, restless, thick with the pressure of the approaching storm. The air tasted metallic, and the ground trembled softly, as if something beneath it were shifting. Elias Warren woke to the low groan of trees in the dark and the unmistakable scent of rising water. Atsadi was already outside, standing barefoot on the elevated porch of his cabin, eyes fixed on the horizon, where a wall of bruised clouds pressed against the sky. "The storm has changed its path," he said quietly. "It comes straight for us now." Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. How bad will it be? Atsadi didn't look away from the clouds. "Bad enough to test every beam we raised." The heat rose quickly, quicker than Elias had ever felt. By mid-morning, moisture clung to everything. Sweat dripped from his hair, soaking into his shirt. Tools left outside glistened with a thin sheen of condensation. The swamp's surface quivered with each gust of wind, as if waiting for the chance to overrun the land again. Atsadi moved with calm purpose. He checked the posts, ensuring each one still rested firmly on its stone footing. He tightened vine lashings that held portions of the bark siding. He walked beneath the cabin once more, letting the air flow across his palms. "Feel it," he said to Elias. "The swamp breathes too. Before it attacks, it exhales all its heat." Elias knelt and reached under the cabin. The air there was still cool, but less so than yesterday. The swamp was pushing its warmth upward. "Will the airflow still be enough?" he asked. Atsadi took a long breath. "We will learn today." The first raindrops fell thick and warm, splattering against leaves with heavy pops. Within minutes, rain poured in sheets, hammering the bark siding and rattling across the slatted floor. Steam rose from the ground as water met heat. Elias and Atsadi hurried to the edge of the clearing to watch. The remains of the settlers' sunken cabin began to darken again as the rising flood pooled beneath it. Mud churned, bubbling like a cauldron. The broken floorboards flexed and popped. A corner beam dissolved into sludge. "Your cabin cannot fight back," Atsadi murmured. "It lies flat. It cannot change." Lightning flashed, revealing the stark contrast. The Cherokee cabin standing high, rigid, yet breathing with the storm. Its bark siding shedding water, its elevated floor untouched by the swelling earth. But then the wind shifted. A violent gust struck the raised cabin, sending bark flaps rattling like loose shields. The structure swayed, not dangerously but noticeably. Elias's heart hammered. "It's moving!" "It should." Atsadi's voice was steady. "A living home bends, a dead one breaks." Wind-driven rain blasted across the clearing, turning the world into a blur of motion and noise. Elias shielded his face, squinting through the torrent. Water surged over the swamp floor, rising inch by inch toward the posts of the Cherokee cabin. When it reached the first stone footing, Elias held his breath. The water circled the stone, but it could not climb the cedar post above it. There was no direct contact, no capillary path for moisture to rise. Atsadi's engineering held, but only for the moment. The water kept rising. By mid-storm, an hour that felt like a year, the flood had swallowed the stone bases entirely. The posts now hovered just above the roiling surface. Elias felt the dread crawling up his throat. If it rises another hand's width, it will not, Atsadi said quietly. This is its highest breadth. And he was right. The water plateaued, swirling angrily but not climbing further. The swamp had reached its limit, but the storm wasn't finished. A heavy wind rolled through the clearing, bending trees until their trunks groaned. One snapped in the distance with a sound like a gunshot. The raised cabin shuddered. The wind slammed through the ventilation gaps, forcing the structure to whistle sharply. Bark siding slapped against itself. Rain sprayed through the slats, dappling the floorboards. Elias gripped the railing. It's too strong. Look! A panel of bark broke loose, spinning away into the storm. Elias cursed and dropped to retrieve the toolkit. We have to repair it. No, Atsadi said firmly. Not now. The cabin must move freely. If you seal it tight, the wind will push against it harder. The storm raged on. All around them, the swamp tried to eat the world. Floodwater churned. Logs floated past like corpses of failed shelters. Insects scattered in frantic waves, fleeing rising water. A flash of lightning illuminated the settlers' second cabin, the one they had rebuilt in desperation months earlier. Elias saw it bow forward, the front beam bending under moisture that had already seeped deep inside. In the next bolt of lightning, the wall buckled inward with a colossal splash. The storm had found weakness and devoured it. Atsadi didn't turn away. The swamp never forgets, he murmured. It takes back what is not built for it. Thunder crashed overhead. Elias felt the elevated cabin tremble beneath him. It stood. Still the airflow moved. Still the posts held fast above the swollen ground. Hours passed. The storm's fury finally loosened, reducing to a steady rain. The water under the cabin retreated slowly, inch by inch, leaving behind slick trails of silt. Elias leaned against one of the posts, exhausted. It lived, he whispered. Your cabin lived. No, Atsadi said. It endured. Living comes after the storm. As the clouds thinned, pale evening light filtered through the dripping forest. The raised cabin glistened, wet, weathered, but intact. Behind it, the settler's cabin lay half consumed by mud, sagging like a dying creature. For a moment, Elias felt triumph, but Atsadi shook his head. Do not trust the quiet yet, he said softly. The worst test is what happens when the swamp shifts its shape. Elias frowned. What do you mean? Atsadi pointed toward the waterline, where the mud was pulling back in thick waves, dragging roots downward. Storms force the swamp to change. When the land settles again, only one kind of foundation will survive it. When the floodwaters drained, the land itself began to move, and one cabin adapted while the other crumbled. Elias wasn't prepared for what the swamp would reveal next. The storm had passed, but the swamp was far from calm. Elias Warren stood beneath a low canopy of clouds, watching the water retreat in slow, heavy breaths. Pools that had swallowed the land hours earlier drained unevenly, leaving behind slick muck and strange patterns in the earth. The ground did not simply dry. It shifted, slumped, reorganized itself, like a creature settling back into its true shape. Atsadi walked in silence beside him, gaze trained downward. The storm was only the first part, he said. Now the swamp decides what stays. Elias looked toward the settlers' cabin, their second attempt at building a frontier home. It had survived the storm with its walls mostly upright. But now, the mud around it moved in dark, swirling patterns as water receded. One corner sagged deeper. A soft but relentless cracking sound echoed from beneath the floor. Elias approached cautiously. It's sinking again, Atsadi shook his head. Not sinking. The earth beneath it is changing. A heavy house cannot move when the land moves. Elias knelt, watching the soil draw downward in a spiraling motion beneath the foundation beam. The wood creaked, stretched, and then, like an old bone breaking, split sharply along the grain. The whole structure tilted further until a gaping seam formed in the wall. Elias felt the loss in his chest like the heaviness of a funeral. It never had a chance. No, Atsadi agreed. It fought the land instead of learning from it. He then turned toward his own raised cabin. The floodwaters had left streaks of silt on the posts, but the structure remained level, perfectly balanced upon its stone footings. The earth beneath it had shifted too, but the cabin had shifted with it. Elias frowned. Why didn't yours twist or sink? Atsadi knelt beside one of the stones. Because it does not press down into the earth, it rests on it. When the land moves, the cabin can slide only a little, enough to stay whole. Elias ran his fingers over the stone, cool now, smooth, slightly muddy around the edges. The settlers thought burying posts gave strength. It gives weight, Atsadi corrected. Strength comes from knowing how to move without breaking. They moved beneath the raised cabin, and Elias felt the familiar cool air flow upward, even after the storm. The soil here was firm, dry in patches, as though protected by the simple fact that the house hovered instead of touched. Atsadi traced his hand along the underside of a beam. The cedar was damp from rain, but not swollen. This wood takes water only on the outside. Inside, it stays strong. The storm has not changed it. Elias felt a deep sense of awe. Everything the Cherokee had built was flexible, breathing, adaptive, and everything the settlers had built was rigid, heavy, doomed. He straightened. We have to teach the others. If we rebuild the settlement using your method, raised floors, stones under posts, smoke-cured beams, we could survive this land. Atsadi watched him carefully. Teaching is easy. Accepting change is hard. He walked to the edge of the clearing, where the sun began breaking through the clouds, steaming water off the leaves. The air smelled cleaner, cedar sweet, warmed earth, the after scent of last night's rain. Come, Atsadi said. There is something more to learn. They crossed a narrow berm where water still trickled. Atsadi stopped beside a tree stripped of bark. This, he said, laying a hand on the pale trunk, is where I found strong birch for siding. But it must be dried in the right season. Cut too early, it will mold before you use it. Cut too late, it will split in the heat. Elias furrowed his brow. So even the timing matters? Especially the timing, Atsadi replied. The swamp decides how long wood must rest. He showed Elias the curing racks, a series of angled poles where cedar planks leaned toward a shallow fire pit. The coals inside glowed a dull orange. Thin trails of smoke rose steadily, carrying moisture away from the wood. Each piece of timber had been chosen for placement, some closer to heat, some farther away, depending on their density. Elias crouched beside the rack, fascinated by the intricate balance. We rushed, he admitted. We built as fast as possible, trying to get walls up before winter. Atsadi's voice softened. Rushing is how people lose more than time. Wood remembers haste. Elias ran his thumb along a plank. Even wet from the storm, it felt different. Tough, flexible, aromatic, ready. This could last decades, maybe a lifetime. Atsadi nodded. My grandfather's house still stands, raised on stones, fed by wind, cured by fire. The swamp tried to claim it many times. It never won. They walked back to the raised cabin, stepping over fallen branches and debris washed in overnight. The structure stood proudly against the settling haze, lit warm by the sun's first true rays of the morning. Elias stared at it, understanding now that it wasn't just a shelter. It was a conversation with the land, a partnership. Behind them, the settlers' damaged cabin groaned louder as new cracks spread. Elias turned. If we don't change how we build, the entire settlement will collapse within a year. Yes, Atsadi said simply. But if you change, your homes will outlive the storms. One of the settlers, a broad-shouldered man named Barrett, approached with mud still caked to his trousers. He wiped rain from his brow and looked at Elias. Saw yours survived. Ours didn't. Elias felt a strange mixture of grief and opportunity. We need to rebuild, he said. But not like before. He nodded toward Atsadi. He can show us how. Barrett shifted uneasily, glancing between them. You mean build like the Cherokee do? Elias held Barrett's gaze. If we want to survive here, yes. Atsadi didn't speak, but his steady expression carried no judgment, only patience. Barrett sighed and looked back at the collapsed cabin. Well, whatever that swamp trick was, it sure beat what we did. Atsadi inclined his head. It is not a trick. It is a conversation. The settler frowned. With the swamp? With the land, Atsadi corrected gently. It always speaks first. We must listen. A warming breeze slipped beneath the raised cabin, brushing Elias's legs. The storm had broken, but the lesson had just begun. Yet even as the settlers gathered to learn, Elias sensed something deeper. These methods weren't just survival tricks. They were the start of a legacy that would outlast them all. The sun dipped low over the recovering swamp, casting long amber streaks through drifting mist. Water pooled in shallow depressions, reflecting sky and branches like fractured mirrors. The land was quieter now, tired, rearranged, but settling into its new form. Elias Warren stood at the edge of the clearing, hands resting on the railing of Atsadi's raised cabin, watching how the swamp slowly withdrew from its brief reign. Behind him, the settlers gathered around Atsadi in a hesitant semicircle. Some carried split logs, others brought rope, stone, or half-dried planks they'd salvaged from their ruined homes. They had lost much in the storm, and learned more in a day than in a season. Atsadi placed a cedar beam across two stones and nodded for Elias to speak. Elias cleared his throat. Before last night, we thought we knew how to build. Not here, but in lands far to the west. We forced our cabins into the ground and sealed them tight, and the swamp destroyed everything we made. He stepped aside so the settlers could see the cedar beam clearly. The Cherokee don't build against this land. They build with it. Their homes breathe. They rise above the ground. They let air do the work we never understood. One of the settlers, a wiry man named Thatch, raised a hand. But won't raising the cabin make it weaker in wind? Storm nearly blew the siding off. Atsadi answered gently, laying a palm on the beam. A house that stands stiff in the wind breaks. A house that moves with the wind lives. The bark siding should shake. The cabin should sway. That is its strength. Thatch nodded slowly, absorbing the idea. Elias stepped forward again. And the posts rest on stone instead of being buried. That lets the cabin shift with the land instead of dying when the ground changes shape. Barrett grunted. Makes sense. Our posts sank deeper every year. It was like watching a house drown in slow motion. A few settlers chuckled wearily. Humor returned only when fear had been replaced by understanding. Atsadi then held up a plank, cured with smoke. Its surface glowed warm in the fading light. This wood will last decades, he said. More if you keep it dry. Cedar, hickory, birch. They are not just materials, they are choices. Choices that respect the swamp's rules. He pointed toward the ruins of the settler's second cabin, now visibly twisted, sinking unevenly as the earth settled beneath it. That one fought the swamp. It lost. Then he gestured at his own home, elevated and clean despite the storm's violence. The siding rattled softly in a passing breeze, like a slow, rhythmic breath. This one listens, Atsadi said. It remains. The settlers fell silent. Even the air felt reverent. Elias walked beneath the raised cabin one last time that day. The space was cool, shaded, and alive with faint movement of air. The soil was dry again, almost dusty, while just 10 steps away, the swamp floor was still wet and soft. The difference was astonishing, the lesson undeniable. Atsadi came to stand beside him. You will build one of your own soon, Elias nodded. Not one, many. We'll teach the others. We have to. Atsadi studied him for a long moment. And when storms come again, your homes will rise with the wind and breathe with the air. They will not fear the swamp. Elias looked out across the clearing, where the settlers now sorted stones, measured planks, and began sketching new foundations. They moved slower, more thoughtful, more deliberate. They were becoming apprentices to the land itself. The sun dipped lower, turning the swamp a molten gold. Insects drifted lazily in the warm light, wings flashing like sparks. A heron glided low over the water, its shadow rippling on the surface. Elias breathed deeply. The air held the faint fragrance of cedar resin and smoke, a scent of survival, of knowledge, older than any cabin he had ever built. He turned to Atsadi. How long will this method last? 10 years? 20? Atsadi chuckled softly. Some of our homes have stood since my grandfather's grandfather. Raised cabins, smoke-cured wood, air flowing from below. These things last longer than names. Elias felt the truth of it settle into him. This wasn't just a technique. It was a world view, one that saw the land as a partner, not an obstacle. One that listened before building. One that understood survival wasn't force, but balance. The swamp had tested both cabins, and only the one that breathed survived. A quiet melancholy touched Elias's chest, mixed with hope. I wonder what else we've forgotten. Atsadi's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sky burned orange. Many things, but some knowledge waits. If you keep listening, the land will speak. The settlers continued working behind them, gathering stones, trimming boards, preparing to rebuild not just their homes, but their understanding of the frontier. The swamp breathed out a long, cooling sigh as dusk approached. The first new raised foundation would be laid tomorrow. Stories like this remind us that survival was never about strength alone. It was about listening to the knowledge that came long before us. If these forgotten engineering traditions move you the way they move us, consider subscribing. There are many more lessons from the old frontier waiting to be rediscovered. Some homes stand because they are strong, but others stand because they understand the land beneath them.